Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 514 for the 29th of Nissan in a regular year. There's this really interesting book by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink. It's actually the first Malcolm Gladwell book I ever read, and it happens to be my favorite. Maybe that and The Tipping Point, actually, but maybe Blink. So anyway, Blink is all about intuition. It's all about the power, this seemingly magical power that people have to kind of just like sense that something is off or sense the truth about something. Like, do you ever meet somebody and you know instantaneously that you're going to have a really strong connection with them? Or somebody says something to you and you just have this intuition that they're lying. Or sometimes maybe it's like the phone rings and you have a sense of who it is on the phone, you know, things like that. Like there's this, we call it intuition. Maybe we call it like a sixth sense, ESP, being psychic, you know? And so what Malcolm Gladwell asserts in this book is that a lot of this kind of stuff, a lot of the stuff that we call intuition is actually not magical at all, or at least not magical in the way that we think it is. It actually could be explained very plainly and very logically according to pretty basic psychology. So early on in the book, I think this is like the first example he gives, he tells this story, this real thing that happened where there were these archaeologists and they were presented with these artifacts at some museum. And the artifacts were all replicas of real artifacts, but they were all fake. But they were perfect replicas, like they down to every minute detail of the original artifacts. These fake artifacts were constructed in such a way that they were really there to replicate every single detail of the original artifacts. But yet, when the archaeologists were presented with these artifacts, every single one of them was able to tell that these artifacts were fake. They couldn't say exactly why or how they knew, and they couldn't point to any specific detail about them that told them that these artifacts were fake, but they just had a sense that they were fake. And indeed, they were right. You know, so this is quite amazing. And you kind of think to yourself, like, what's going on there? Are they psychic? Like, how do they know that these artifacts are fake? But in fact, what Malcolm Gladwell asserts, and he kind of, explains this throughout the book, is that what intuition is really just the brain, the logical brain, working really, really fast at really high speed. And we get like kind of like a message from our brain that's faster than the logical brain can kind of break it down, but it's based on logic. It's based on pre-existing experiences that we've had with the world around us, pre-existing patterns that we've picked up on, often in not necessarily the most conscious of ways, but we're taking everything in. So an example that comes to mind for me, which I may or may have not mentioned on the podcast before, this is not from Malcolm Gladwell. This is just my observation, my theory as to why it is that so many people, especially so many children, are scared of clowns, is because the face of a clown, the common makeup of a clown is very confusing to a child, but in a not obvious way. Because the mouth of a clown is often very happy. It's like kind of like exaggerated happy, but the eyes slope downwards. The eyes show that the clown is sad. And this confuses a child because a child is still in that very early stage of starting to recognize patterns around them, especially facial patterns are one of the first things that a child comes to grapple with in the world. And a child learns that a smile means happy, but the eyes also indicate if a person is happy or sad. So if the eyes and the mouth don't match up, then this is an indication to the child, and maybe to a more sensitive adult as well, that this is a person, this clown is somebody that is not to be trusted. This is an untrustworthy person. Now, if you were to ask the child directly, why are you crying? Why do you not want to be near this clown? Why don't you want to look at this clown? They most likely would not be able to tell you, to break it down in such a way that, oh, it's because their eyes are sad, their mouth is happy, and that kind of thing. It's more of this like intuitive sense. But again, this intuition is not baseless. It's not based on nothing. It's based on very real patterns that they've been picking up in the world around them. And this is true for so many things in our lives. When you meet somebody for the first time, you have this sense about them, what type of person they are. Are they friendly? Are they, a good person, a shy person, whatever it is? We kind of pick up these senses all the time. Some people obviously more sensitive to it than others. But this is all based on facts. This is all based on details, facial expressions, body language, all that kind of stuff that we're taking in at all times. Now, there are ways to increase our level of sensitivity to these kind of things, to enhance our intuition, so to speak, to the point that not only can a person just like pick up on what's right in front of them in the moment, but they can actually go so far as to predict the future to a certain extent. Obviously, to a limited extent, nobody definitely knows the future, but they can predict with a certain amount of high level of probability what is most likely going to happen, how a certain person is most likely going to behave, how a certain group of people are most likely going to behave, what the weather forecast is going to be the next day. How do people do this, and why would they want to do this kind of thing? We'll think about it. This comes up in a lot of different industries, whether we're talking about marketing, for example, predicting buying habits of different people. So we look at past buying habits, and we can predict, based on really analyzing and studying past buying habits, we can predict what people are going to buy in the future. There are some really freaky examples of this where actually some marketing companies, or even algorithms, or it's actually computers doing this, Amazon does this all the time, can actually sometimes predict what it is that a person is going to buy before the person themselves knows it. So there was a very crazy example of this in another book that I read. I think it was called A Habit, where Target advertising actually predicted that a teenage girl was pregnant before she actually knew, based on her buying habits and based on what it was that she was pre-purchasing at Target. And then they were sending her advertisements for things that only a pregnant person would buy. So it's really crazy stuff. And again, these skills can be used in all kinds of different ways, some more innocent than others. Psychics often, there's this idea of cold reading, that psychics often what they're doing, so-called quote unquote psychics, they're actually just like studying the person in front of them enough in like a psychological way that they can kind of predict different things based around what it is that they see in front of them. So it's not actually anything so magical. It's actually just like observing. The more observant you become of the world around you, the better you can be at understanding the world around you, and even to a certain extent predicting what will happen in that world. So all of this lines up really well with a statement from the Gemara in Masechet Tamid, page 32a, where it says, Ezeu chacham haroet et hanolad. Who is the wise one? He who sees that which is born and created. And so what the Gemara is alluding to there is this same principle, but kind of in a more basic way, and in a way that actually relates to our own working on ourselves and our own service of God. That basically, a person who is wise is somebody who pays attention to the consequences of their actions. They don't, we're all about living in the moment on the one hand. On the other hand, it's like, the more we do need to live in such a way that it's ideal to live in such a way that we're sensitive, not just to the world around us in this kind of way, but also in a way that relates to ourselves, that we realize the consequences of what it is that we do. And thus we act in an intentional manner. We act in a way that we have an awareness of the consequences of everything that we do. This is what distinguishes wise people from those who are not. The inverse of this, another way of thinking about this, is the recognition that everything has a cause. No matter what happens, in the world, there's always, it's coming from somewhere. Things don't end up the way they are for no reason. there's always a cause to everything, whether this is a psychological thing or just on a very simple level. Like if you watch a movie that's like, let's say a short film that's 10 minutes long, that movie that's 10 minutes long may have taken months or even years to produce, to put together. There's so much work that goes into that. And then what you're seeing is the final product. So what this translates to really in terms of our service of God is the recognition of the fact that our world too, and really ourselves as well, have a cause to it. We are the consequence of something. What is that something? That's God, obviously, right? So there's like the famous example that's often given of if you were in the middle of the desert and you saw a watch, would you just assume that the watch just ended up there randomly? No, you would assume that somebody was there before you and they dropped that watch there, and that someone created the watch, made the watch out of different materials and stuff like that. So too, if you were to walk into somebody's office and if you were to see a manuscript on their desk of this really amazing novel, and if you started to read the novel and you saw that it was like really something truly incredible, and then you were to ask the guy sitting at the desk, did you write this? Where did it come from? And if he were to reply, oh no, that was just like a bunch of ink spilled on my desk and it turned into that, or oh no, there was a monkey in the room before and they randomly clicked on a bunch of keys on the keyboard and this is what resulted, you most likely wouldn't believe them, right? You would look at the paper, you would look at the novel, and you would understand that there was an actual person behind it who actually sat there and thoughtfully wrote out the novel. So too is the same thing with our worlds, that when we look around the world around us, if somebody's really honest and if somebody's really wise, using the terminology of the Gemara and of the Tanya, as we'll see, they would understand that there's a primal cause to everything. And not only would they understand it, but they would they'd really, they'd see it. Like it'd be very apparent to them, just like the archaeologists that saw, like they with their eyes, they literally saw that these artifacts were fake. This is the reality that a person would live in if they really had this true comprehension of the causality of the entire world, to the point that it wouldn't just be an intellectual exercise anymore, but it would actually be something that would be visible, that would actually be perceivable in this kind of intuitive sense. Now, in Hebrew, in Chassidus, the word that I liken to intuition, that I think translates is a good way to translate intuition, is Chochma. Chochma is this initial spark whereby you really sense that something is true, even though you can't actually articulate it and you can't put it into words, which to me sounds very much like intuition. And what we're going to be learning about in today's Tanya is that there's a really interesting link between wisdom, this chokhmah, this intuition, and fear of God, awe of God. And we'll see that there's a twofold relationship there. How so? Because, so as we're going to learn, we're going to learn about how there's actually two levels of fear of God or awe of God, depending on how you translate it. In Hebrew, the word is Yirah. The lower level is kind of like a basic level of awe of God that's generated through the intellect, that comes about through our intellectual understanding and comprehension, that we look around at the world around us and we see how awesome the world is, and we're kind of like awed by the whole thing. Like, we go to see this like awesome wonder of nature or something like that, and it puts us into this awesome kind of state. But the second level of awe of God is the focus is not on what it is that we're seeing here in the world, but the focus is actually on God himself, where we recognize that these things are coming from somewhere. It's not like that they themselves are awesome and that we're awed by all of God's creations, but we're actually awed by God himself, because we recognize where these things come from, and we recognize the fact that all of these things are actually not and nothing in comparison to him. So it's a return back to the source. And this is a procedural kind of thing. So it's like, in order to get to this higher level of awe, where it's like we're really just focusing on the source and the nullification of everything in the presence of God, we need to focus on the lower levels first. We need to proceed with this more intellectual understanding and comprehension of the world around us, which requires a certain level of basic subservience, a basic level of kind of getting out of yourself and seeing the world around you. This relates to a saying in Pirkei Avos in chapter 3, Mishnah 17, where it says, Im en Yirah and Chochma. Without awe, there can be no wisdom. So you need to have a basic level of subservience before even coming to any kind of awareness at all of reality, of truth. An essential tool to cultivate this basic level of awe is Torah and mitzvahs. Because when we do Torah and mitzvahs, when we perform mitzvahs and we learn God's Torah, this gives us a sense of the fact that we need to be subservient to God. This kind of puts us in this subservient position. And doing so gives us this, it cultivates within us this basic level of awe of God, which ultimately will lead us to having this awareness, this chochma, this certain level of chochma. Now, once we have this level of Chochma, then ultimately this will translate, and through this meditation and contemplation of the awesomeness of the world around us, this will translate into that next level of really recognizing the source of everything, which is ultimately God. Just like the more, going back to that original example, the more the archaeologists studied, the more expert they were in their field in terms of actually sitting there and studying and being subservient to the field of archaeology, the better they were able to attune themselves to the fakeness of the fake artifacts. Just like the more a person is involved in Torah and mitzvahs and looking at the world around them and meditating upon the greatness of God, the more attuned they can be to seeing the source of it all, seeing where it all ultimately comes from. And this is where the flip side of that saying comes into play, which is in Chochma and Yirah, if there is no wisdom, there is no awe, comes into play. That's actually from the same place in Pirkei Avos, where the full saying is in Chochma and Yirah, in Yirah and Chochma. So we have both things at play. If there is no Chochma, there's no Yirah. But at the same time, if there's no Yirah, there is no Chochma. So these two things are intertwined together. So with all of that being said, I think this is a good time to get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this. And hopefully this preface that I gave you guys can help you understand all of these things in a little bit more of a concrete way. For context, we're beginning a new chapter today. It's chapter 43 of Likkutei Amarim. So for context, we've been talking a lot about this idea of fear of God, awe of God, all of that. And we left off last time at the end of chapter 42, talking about how as much as we do want to cultivate this higher intellectual kind of understanding of God to the best of our ability to try to get this sense of awe of God, there is something to be said about this lower level of fear as well. And it's not something that needs to be discarded. It's something that we actually do need to cultivate on a daily basis and to have with us habitually all the time within us. So this is what we would call lower level fear. So now we're going to understand that. So the Alter Rebbe says, so about this lower level fear, which in Hebrew is called Yirah Tata, which is basically to keep God's commandments. So it's the basic level that is, this fear is what motivates us to keep God's commandments in the aspect of sur mera, of abstaining from evil, ve'aseh tov, and doing good. It is said in the Mishnah about this, it is said, Im en yira en chochma. So this was the first part. If there is no fear, there is no wisdom. So meaning that the prerequisite to having wisdom is to have fear. So meaning if you want to at all be a wise person, to have any kind of like deeper understanding about the world, you need to have this lower level of fear. So we'll try to understand what that means. So then the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that in this aspect of this lower level of fear, there's actually an aspect that is katnos, that's lesser, and there's an aspect of greatness, gadlus. What do we mean by the greatness? So the katnos, he doesn't go into it here, but my basic understanding of that is just like a basic feeling of fear, like you just don't want God to punish you and you don't want to go against the will of God. Like it's just like very, very, very basic. And the aspect of the greatness of this still lower level of fear, it comes from meditation about the greatness of God and about how God fills all the worlds, and from the earth to the heavens, which according to the Gemara in Masachet Chagiga, page 13a, this is a distance from the earth to the heavens is a distance of 500 years. And then between each one of the heavens, each one of the firmaments is another distance of 500 years. And then the Alter Rebbe here cites the Gemara there in Chagiga, where it says, Reglei chayot keneged kulan v'chulei, that the feet of the chayos, which is the lowest level of angels, they transcend all the other levels, meaning to say it's basically pointing at the fact that each world is far, far, far superior to the next as you go higher and higher through the worlds. And so the basic idea here is that the Alter Rebbe is trying to really point at the vastness of God's embodiment throughout all the worlds, and so too also in all the hishtalshelus of all the worlds. So the hishtalshelus is like the chain reaction, like the flow, the evolution from world to world up until the highest of all worlds. So basically, this is what the Alter Rebbe is saying, that a person could meditate upon and come to this sense of fear through this meditation. The more a person meditates on how God is present in all of these different things. However, the Alter Rebbe says this type of fear, even though it is coming from this deep intellectual place and it seems very, very profound, it's still considered an external type of fear, a Yirah chitzonit, and it's considered a lower type of fear. Why? So this seems at first glance a little strange. Like we thought that this intellectual type of fear is a higher type of fear, but really the Alter Rebbe is teaching us that no, it's not. Because it comes from, because it is drawn down from the worlds, which are, what are the worlds? The worlds are the vestments of the king, God, who hides himself within them in order to vivify them and in order to keep them in existence. Just that these are the gate and opening for us to keep Torah and mitzvahs. So meaning to say that, just to explain that a little bit, so meaning to say that if a person is sitting and meditating upon the vastness of God and how God is present in all of creation and everywhere, the highest realms, the lowest realms, all of the heavens and everything, it might seem really, really deep, like he's really meditating upon God, but the Alter Rebbe is telling us that no, he's still stuck at the level of the externalities, the vestments of God, which is the way that God vests himself in each of these worlds. Which is not to say that's a bad thing, but it still is considered to be on the lower level. So now if we want to reach this higher level of fear, which is this fear, this shame, this kind of inner fear or inner awe, however we want to translate it, which comes from the inner aspect of godliness that is found within the worlds, about this is what that second part of the phrase is talking about when it says, Im en Chochma en Yirah, that if there is no wisdom, there is no fear. So we're going to try to understand what that means. That meaning that if we want to get this higher level of fear, we need a prerequisite of Chochma. What is Chochma? Chochma is, in Hebrew, it's made up of two words. It's made up of the word koach and it's made up of the word ma. So it's kuf chet mem he, or koach ma. And if you flip around the letters a little bit, then it spells Chochma. And so what does that mean? Koach ma literally translates to mean the power of what? So this is indicated, and this is a topic that's talked a lot about in Chassidus, how there's something about Chochma that involves the aspect of bittul, of nullification, of self-abnegation, that it's kind of not really here kind of thing. It doesn't really have a substantial existence of its own. And this is hinted at in a verse which the Alter Rebbe cites here from Eov, from Job, chapter 28, verse 12, which says, "V'chochma me'ayin timatzeh," that literally translates to mean, and chochma, from where should you find it? So that's sort of the way that it's usually translated, is like, where do we find wisdom? But more literally, the word ayin, which is translated usually to mean where in this verse, also means nothingness. So it's meaning to say, it's hinting at this idea that Chochma comes from nothingness. There's, again, this very like ethereal quality about Chochma that is not really, it doesn't really have an existence of its own in a full sense. So now to explain all of this, we're going to try to understand what wisdom is exactly. What do we mean by this thing that wisdom is nothingness? It comes from nothingness. What's going on with that? So to explain this, the Alter Rebbe begins by citing the Gemara in Masechet Tamid, page 32a, where it says, "Vezeu chacham haro'eh et hanolad." Who is the chacham? Who is the wise person? The one who sees that which is born. Meaning to say, the one who sees how something is born, like how something becomes nothing from something, like recognizes the source of everything, like recognize the idea that things did not just occur on their own. They didn't just come about on their own, but actually everything here in the world comes about through the word of God and through the spirit of his mouth. As it says in Tehillim, chapter 33, verse 6, it says, "U'v'ruach piv kol tzva'am," that and by the breath of his mouth, all of their hosts were created. So meaning to say that, and we're going to learn about this a lot more in Tanya later on, about how everything came about through God's speech. So the basic idea is recognizing the fact that the world has a source to it, recognizing the fact that these things aren't just here. We're not just here randomly. It's not just chaos. It's the famous analogy that is often given for this is like if somebody were walking in the middle of the desert and they were to find a watch. Their immediate assumption would be that somebody was probably in that desert not too long ago, right? They wouldn't think, oh, the watch just naturally occurred there randomly. They would assume that the watch came from somewhere. And so too, the Alter Rebbe is teaching us here that a wise person recognizes the fact that this entire universe, this entire world is that watch. This entire universe has had to have come from somewhere, needed to have a source. And that source is God. And that source is God's mouth, God's words, God's speech. And thus, when a person really recognizes the fact that the heavens and the earth and everything in it, all of creation, all come from somewhere, they all come from God's breath and his mouth, they totally lose their existence entirely. And they become like not a nothingness, like they become totally nullified the same way like the light of the sun inside of the sun. So like if you were to shine a ray of sunlight inside of the sun, that ray of sunlight would disappear because the sunlight only has its own existence when it's outside of the sun, when it's removed from the sun. So when we revert everything back to its original source, when we see how everything comes from this place in God, then it loses its independent existence, and it becomes nullified. It becomes self-abnegated. And now the Alter Rebbe is going to make this really personal, and he's going to say that a person should not exempt himself from this idea. So we shouldn't think that, oh, wow, the whole world is so amazing and so great and it's all nullified in God and I'm here and I'm witnessing this. The Alter Rebbe is saying, you're part of this. You are part of this whole reality that is subsumed within God and nullified to God. So your body, your soul, your different parts of your soul, your nefesh, your ruach, your neshama are all nullified. B'mtzios, it's called, like totally nullified in the word and in the speech of God. And not only that, and we learned about this previously, so here, this is really where we'll start to see, if you've really been studying these episodes and listening to the podcast, we start to see that there's a buildup, and you can go back and review a lot of it, because a lot of it really is coming into play here, is that we learned about how God's speech and God's thoughts are actually really unified with him. So this is what makes it different than human speech, because in human speech, like even though our speech is very much connected to our brain and to our bodies and everything, once we speak things, then that speech, those words are out there in the universe. They have kind of like this independent existence outside of us, which is not the case with God. That doesn't happen. God's speech and God's thoughts are really always stay one and the same with him. And the Alter Rebbe says that this is what is meant by a verse, which again is from Eov, from Job, chapter 28, verse 28, which says, Hen yirat Hashem hi chochma, that here we find that the fear of God is wisdom. So again, there's this connection between wisdom and fear. However, says the Alter Rebbe, we cannot achieve this level of Yirah and Chochma other than by keeping Torah and mitzvahs through the lower level of fear, this external level of fear. So it's like we shouldn't think, when we were talking originally about this lower level of fear, which is just more external and it's about like the world and all that stuff, we shouldn't dismiss it. We shouldn't just say like, oh yeah, that's just like superficial. That's not really learning about God. It's not really getting in tune with the real fear of God. That level of the lower level of fear is actually a prerequisite to get to this higher level of fear. And this is why it says, Im en yirah and chochma, that without fear, there is no wisdom. So it's sort of like this like progression. Is like, if you wanted to look at it like a chart, I don't know if anybody's taking notes on this. I think it might be useful because there is a lot of information here, is that it's sort of like we start with lower level of fear. We start with Yirah, Tata, the lower level of fear. And that lower level of fear is like that baseline, like having a sense of humility, having a sense of like recognition that there is a creator in this world. There is something going on. That lower level of fear is what gives a person wisdom. That makes person somebody wise. Like basically a wise person is somebody who sees what's going on, who sees behind the scenes, like in like the stock market or something like that. A wise person isn't the person that's going to be buying stocks when they're high. A wise person is the one who's going to be buying stocks when they're low, because they see what's going on. They understand the internal theory of everything. They see where things are going. So again, in order to achieve a basic level of wisdom, in order to be considered a wise person, you need to have that baseline level of fear. So it goes fear, lower level of fear, then comes the wisdom. Then through that wisdom, then you cultivate that wisdom. Like once you have developed that wisdom, now you're a wise person, you can really cultivate that wisdom. And that wisdom can really help you to have more fear, to have this even higher level of fear, this level of fear where you actually become even more than humble. You start to recognize the fact that you don't really have your own existence of your own, and nothing in the world has that existence of its own. So that will lead you to that higher level of fear. So again, it's lower fear, wisdom, more cultivated wisdom to higher level of fear. So that's the end of the section for today. And tomorrow we're going to move on and go a little bit away from the fear discussion and move into love, and how just as there are 2 levels of fear of God, there are also 2 levels of loving God. So stay tuned for that, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.